So do you ever wish you could escape your past? Is there some event or some experience that you so wish you could leave behind, that somehow it just, if there was some way for you just to escape it and be done with it. But you've tried to escape it, but it kind of keeps coming up. I think that's something that we all wrestle with. And the thing that I've come to understand is that we can't escape our past. But the fact that we can't escape it doesn't mean we can't be free of it. Because the thing that I have found is that when we have traumatic experiences in our life, and that could be receiving trauma, or sometimes it means we actually inflict trauma. But when we have those experiences, what we think will happen is that we'll be able to deal with it over time somehow. That as time goes by, if we could just kind of push it down, right? When that feeling starts to come up or that memory starts to come up, you're like, I'll just push it down. And the feeling is that if I push it down long enough and I do that often enough, eventually time will clear it out. And eventually everything will be fine. And then we reach a point in our lives where we feel like life is going okay, and I've pushed it down long enough and hard enough that it's all gone. But then one day something happens, and we find ourselves face to face with that memory, where it's a trauma that just kind of blows up from our past. And we're like, I thought I was done with that. I thought I'd gotten, escaped from that. And what we find is that if we haven't done the work to really deal with it, when it finally comes up again, that experience, that pain, can actually be crippling. But the good news is that there are things we can do to actually give us freedom from that. All right, so today we're wrapping up our series, When Life Does Not Go As Planned. And that's specifically what I want to look at. This idea of being face to face with trauma from our past. Because you remember that we've been talking about the life of this guy named Joseph, right, coming from the book of Genesis, and we followed through a whole bunch of things. And we find this week, as we kind of pick up with Joseph, that he is face to face with a past that he thought he had left behind. That he's actually face to face with the people who are responsible for those 13 years of pain and difficulty they had to go through. Right, now remember that Joseph comes from the ancient world. And again, give us context about how far back in time we're talking about. That, if we look at Jesus is 2,000 years behind. We figure the narrative of Moses and the Israelites is probably almost twice as far back, somewhere between like 3,500 and 4,000 years ago. And Joseph is even hundreds of years before that. Right, as I've mentioned before, that Joseph's narrative is actually kind of the origin story of Moses and the Israelites. And the reason I point that out is because the ancient world was a brutal world where human life was not highly valued. People would do things to harm people, often seeming like they did it with little thought. Right? We saw that Joseph really experienced that. That because his brothers were jealous of him, to deal with that, they actually sold him into slavery. And then we found that Joseph's life kind of continues to have difficulty. That he's in this environment where he's working as a slave, and he kind of makes the best of it, and he starts to kind of do reasonably well in that environment, and even starts to rise up and have a bit of freedom within the context of that environment. And then he ends up being thrown in prison because of an accusation, an unproven accusation for a crime that he didn't commit. And the thing that we find is that with Joseph, as he goes through all these experiences, and we kind of catch him later in life, as we will today, we find that Joseph becomes a very changed person. Right? That we first met Joseph back in the first week. Right? Joseph was 17 years old. We know that he was a little bit spoiled. He was somewhat self-entitled. But this week, as we catch up with Joseph, Joseph is actually about 40 years old. And in that time, he's changed a lot, as I think all of us would change. But he especially changes because of the things he's been through. That the kid who was so self-entitled and somewhat spoiled is now becoming compassionate. He's starting to care for people. And he's also developed some skills, not things we would have necessarily expected, but because of the way he approached that time, doing the best with each day that he could, he started to develop leadership skills. Right? He also started to kind of learn how to manage people. He also learned how to manage resources. Right? And all these things are part of what helped Joseph grow to be someone very different. Now remember that as we wrapped up last time, after that 13 years of difficulty that Joseph had been through, he started to experience a very unexpected circumstance. Remember that he was actually offered the chance to go to work for Pharaoh. In other words, offered a chance to go to work for the king of Egypt. And not just offered a chance, I mean, if the king of Egypt offers you a job, you take it, of course. But the job that he's offered is actually kind of pretty cool. He's actually effectively offered the chance to be the second most powerful person in the land of Egypt. Now remember that the way that came together is that the Pharaoh had these dreams, and Joseph helped him to understand the dreams. And what he realizes is a period of high dichotomy is about to come, right? In the sense that about 7 years of we call it of plenty, of 7 years of just rich harvest, lots of food. But there were then going to be 7 years of famine. And so what Joseph said to Pharaoh is that, hey, you got to put together a plan to deal with this. And Joseph laid out that plan. And Pharaoh said, well, you've got a plan. You're a smart guy. Who better than you to implement it? And that's where we left things off. Well, now if we pick up this week, a number of years have gone by. And Joseph is actually now very integrated into Egyptian society, that he actually has a really good job. He's kind of an aristocrat in this sense. He's actually gotten married. He's very powerful. He even has 2 sons. And so for Joseph, everything is going incredibly well. I mean, in modern terms, what we would say is that he's got a great job, lots of influence, an awesome family, and he's well respected in society. So his life is going well. And since his life is now going well, we might think, or he might think, that all that pain he went through in the past is in the rearview mirror, never to be thought of again, never to be dealt with again. But is that how it works in your life? I know it's not how it works in my life. Right? When I have difficulties or traumas from my past, and I don't go through the process to deal with those things, they just seem to pop up at times. And what we find in the case of Joseph is that because he hasn't had that opportunity to really deal with it, it's going to pop up for him in a very, very real way. Now remember that Joseph's job is a tough one. He's responsible for managing the food supply of Egypt. And so what that meant was, for those initial 7 years, he had to make sure that as the food was growing well, that they collected it and they stored it in an effective way, so that when the 7 years of famine came, they would have those stores to draw upon. And Joseph did a really good job at that. And as we pick up the narrative this week, the entire 7 years of good harvest have passed, and we're now 2 years into the time of famine. But because Joseph did such a good job, Egypt is finding that they still have plenty of food. In fact, Joseph did such a good job that they have more than enough food for all the people in Egypt, and decide that they can even start to sell the food, or some of the food, to people in the surrounding region. So that means that people living outside of Egypt have the opportunity to come to Egypt and buy supplies. Well, what we find is that eventually Joseph's family, who lives in the outer part of the region near Egypt, reaches the point where they're experiencing famine and they need food. And word that food is available reaches them. So Joseph's father, Jacob, who's still alive, and we're talking about almost 20 years since Joseph disappeared, his father is still alive and head of the family. And so Jacob, Joseph's father, tells the older brothers, the 10 older brothers who kidnapped Joseph and had him sold, Jacob tells them to travel to Egypt and go see if you can buy us some food. So they do that. Well, when you arrive in Egypt and you want to buy food, who do you talk to? Well, the narrative tells us, now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. Right, so they go to see Joseph and they don't recognize him, right? Because they haven't seen him in 20 years. And he's also kind of deeply integrated into Egyptian society, right? He actually has the look of an Egyptian. He wears Egyptian clothes. He's had his hair cut the way an Egyptian would. Pharaoh even changed his name to an Egyptian name. And he might have even been wearing makeup, because sometimes in that environment, an aristocrat would actually wear makeup. So as they approach the governor, they do what you do. The narrative tells us. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Now remember that they didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized them. The 10 brothers who had actually come to him and kidnapped him and sold him off are now standing right in front of him. And all those memories come rushing back of all that they had done, because he is now literally face to face with the trauma from his past. And remember the dreams that he used to have, and the dreams that they actually made fun of him for. Remember that he had dreams of them bowing down to him one day. And as he looks to them, they once made fun of me for believing that they would bow down to me one day, and look at this. They're bowing down to me. And he remembers all that they cost him, right? They had plotted to kill him. Ultimately, they captured him, sold him into slavery. I apologize. I got new glasses, and my microphone is really a headache today, so I apologize for that. So these are the people who actually captured him, sold him into slavery, and now standing in front of him is the source of all of his pain and all of his loss. I mean, think about this for a second. If you had the kind of power that Joseph has, and people had done to you what they did to him, what would you do? I mean, for Joseph, the choices are limitless, right? He could simply deny to sell them food. He could have them arrested. He could even have them executed. He has that kind of power. He could do anything he wants. So Joseph does decide to get revenge. Now, he doesn't get revenge at the same level he could have, but he decides to make life pretty hard for him. He says that, hey, you guys aren't from around here. You're from the outer region. You're spies, aren't you? You're here to see what our weaknesses are so that you can come attack us when we're not ready. Now, as the brothers hear that strikes fear into them, because in that world, if you're a spy, there is one way you deal with a spy. You could have them executed. So they very rapidly are like, no, we're not spies. The narrative tells us, they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Now think about all the things Joseph would have felt as he heard that, right? Particularly that last statement. As part of that, it says, one is no more. Well, who are they talking about? Joseph. The person they plotted to kill, sold into slavery, who spent 13 years with complete loss of freedom. He's no more. So that's going to kind of create emotion. He hears them mention his father that it's actually been more than 20 years since he's seen his father. His father that he loved dearly. How much emotion is that going to bring up? And then they mention a younger brother. And one of the things that we don't know is whether Joseph's younger brother, his name is Benjamin, we don't know if Benjamin was even born yet when Joseph got captured. So either he is for the first time hearing that he has a younger brother, or he's being reminded of the younger brother that he has if Benjamin had already been born. And one thing that's important to understand is that Benjamin is Joseph's only full brother, the only brother he has who shares the same mother. So basically, as they're talking, trying to make their case, Joseph is being reminded of all the things that he missed. All the things he missed out on because of these 10 men in front of you. So basically, Joseph continues to push this idea that you're spies, that you're here just to spy on us. And he actually has all of them arrested and thrown into jail. And he leaves them there for a few days to let them kind of, I think, be afraid to kind of, push his power a little bit. And then finally he calls them out after several days and says, I'll tell you what, I'm a reasonable man. I still think you might be spies. But I'm going to give you a chance to prove that you are not spies. I'm going to allow you to buy the grain you came here to buy. And I'm going to allow you to head back home, all of you except one. One has to stay here with me in jail until you return. And when you return, I want you to bring back that youngest brother of yours. If you will do all those things, I will know that you are being truthful and that you are not spies. So if you return under all those conditions, you will be free to buy more food, and I will release your brother, the older brother, to you. So the brother that's actually being held is a brother named Simeon, and the younger brother he wants to return with them is Benjamin. Right? So return with Benjamin, and I'll release Simeon, and you can all go on about your lives. But if you do ever return here, and you do not bring that younger brother, you do not bring Benjamin, I will have Simeon executed, and I will have all of you executed. So under those conditions, take your food, go home, get out of here. Now, as you might imagine, they are racked with fear. Remember, they don't know this is Joseph. They think this is the governor, and it is the governor of Egypt, basically saying that, I've got to let you buy some food, but you're not buying any more unless you meet my conditions. And the thing we find here is that the brothers themselves are face to face with trauma from their past, right? Because they don't know this is Joseph, but it's Joseph doing this to them, right? In other words, they kind of treated Joseph poorly. They find the conditions kind of turned around where Joseph is the powerful one, and they're experiencing all that trauma. But here's something that's kind of interesting in the narrative, is that they don't know this is Joseph. They think it's just the governor, but they attribute all the pain they're experiencing to what they did to Joseph. Because the narrative says this. The brothers said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. They believe this is happening because of what they had done to Joseph. They believe that God was punishing them for what they had done to Joseph. Now, they are being punished because of what they did to Joseph, but it's just the natural outcome of the choices that they had made. Right? They have no idea this is Joseph. But one of the things this shows us is because they kind of committed this crime, this trauma, and never dealt with it, it clearly haunts them all the time. Right? Because first of all, when they're having difficulty, the first thing they blame is what they had done. But notice even the kind of detail they give about what had happened. Remember when he pleaded with us. Remember how distressed he was. They're reliving this over and over again. Right? Even though this was all their fault, because they've not dealt with it, it just sticks with them all the time. And here's what we see, right, is that the thing that they thought would help them kind of escape from Joseph, remember that he was such a thorn in their side, the very thing they did that they thought would help them escape from him has actually imprisoned them, right? That they're imprisoned by their own guilt, a guilt they cannot escape. And they've been carrying that guilt for 2 decades at this point. And you think about what they've done, right? They did what they did to Joseph. They went and lied to their father about what they had done, saying that he'd been killed by an animal. Every time they walk by their father and they see their father grieving over the loss of his son, they're reminded of what they've done, that they never come clean about what they've done. And so they carry that pain on and on with them because what? They keep pushing it down, hoping that it will go away, hiding it away, hoping no one will ever know. And as long as they're doing that, it's never going to go away. So Joseph's now allowed them to return home with the food they've purchased. Simeon, their older brother, is still in jail. So the other brothers arrive home and tell their father what happened. And said that the governor says we can never return to buy more food unless we bring Benjamin with us. And Jacob is afraid. Jacob's like, I've already lost one son, and now you want to take my youngest son? And in fact, if we think about it, we know that Jacob kind of spoiled Joseph. Well, if Benjamin is the younger son of the same mother, how spoiled do you think Benjamin is? Right? Benjamin's been kind of protected, right? He never went out into the faraway fields for fear of what would happen to Joseph. So Jacob's basically like, I guess Simeon's stuck there because you guys aren't going back with Benjamin. And so they keep putting off returning. And they put it off as long as they possibly can. But eventually, the food's running out. They're facing starvation. They have to return to Egypt. And initially, Jacob keeps telling the other brothers, you've got to go back, but you can't take Benjamin. And the other brothers are like, then we can't go back. And so finally, Jacob agrees to allow them to bring Benjamin. And think about how painful this was for the father Jacob. Think about how stressful this was. He was constantly fearful about what's now going to happen to Benjamin. So finally, the brothers return to Egypt with Benjamin. And Joseph sees them, again, as the governor. They think they're just talking to the governor. And Joseph says, okay, great. You've brought that younger brother with you. You guys were telling the truth. Check it out. So now you can buy more food, and you can all head back home. But what Joseph does, as he tells them they can buy food and head back home, Joseph tells his own workers that I want you to actually take something of mine and put it into one of the food bags. And so they do that. So now Joseph's brothers all ride away, the 10 older and his younger one Benjamin. And then Joseph says, hey, those guys stole something from me. Sends the guards to arrest them. It says, whoever stole that from me is going to be imprisoned with me. And the bag that Joseph had told the guards to put the item into was Benjamin's. And so he now tells the older brothers, this guy stole from me. He's going to jail. He's staying with me. The rest of you return home. You guys can go, you're fine, but Benjamin's staying with me. Now, why is Joseph doing that? Well, I think in part, he likes giving the older brothers a really hard time. He likes scaring them. He likes terroring, because he is terrifying them. But also, he does want some alone time with Benjamin. You know, the brother he wanted to be closest to. Now, Benjamin doesn't know any of this yet, so Benjamin's going to be terrified as well. Right? And for the other brothers, they're like, what is this going to do to our father? We're so afraid. We promised him that nothing, we wouldn't let anything happen that would cause Benjamin to be stuck here. And as we think about it, Joseph is probably enjoying his revenge a little bit. Right? He's getting even with the older brothers. But the thing is, the harm that Joseph is creating here is not limited to just the older brothers. Again, how fearful must young Benjamin be? I mean, this would have been a scary trip for him anyway, most likely. And now he's going to be locked up, he believes, forever. And what has all this been doing to Joseph's father? Remember, Joseph deeply loved his father. Well, we get an indication of what it's like for Jacob when one of the other brothers pleads to Joseph to not hold on to Benjamin. When the other brother says, how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. And what we find is that Joseph's attempt at revenge is not just harming those who hurt him. Joseph's hurting other people as well. Right? He's hurting those he loves. Right? He's hurting his father. He's hurting his younger brother. And this is all happening because in spite of Joseph's life going well at this point in time, he still never really dealt with that trauma. Right? His life was going well, and since his life was going well, then he thought that all that pain from his past must be gone. But then one day when that pain unexpectedly shows up, turns out Joseph is not okay. Right? He instantly goes into this mode of revenge. And again, not as severe as he could have gone into it. I mean, he could have had the other brothers executed. But it turns out that that revenge was more severe than he had intended, that he was actually creating collateral damage, right, in the younger brother and in his father. What we find happening to Joseph is that pain from his past still had control over him. That pain from his past was causing him to react in kind of out-of-scale ways, right? Because he'd never had a chance to emotionally process that pain. He'd never had the chance to, or at least had never forgiven those who had harmed him. So when that pain came out, Joseph started harming others. And here's the thing. He's trying to attack one set of brothers. He's affecting his younger brother and his father. And he's creating all that pain. And creating all that pain gives Joseph no relief at all. Because as this exchange is going on, and as the older brother is describing what's happening to Joseph's father, Joseph actually has to leave the room and go into a private area to cry. Because he's overwhelmed by what's happening. And see, and this is a real issue for all of us, right? In our past, we have all experienced pain. And if we're honest, we've all inflicted pain. We've been cruel to someone at some point in our lives. And we've all had cruelness done to us. And one day, potentially when we least expect it, that pain will show up again. It will come back in a memory. It'll come back in talking to someone you haven't talked to in a while. You'll go to a place that triggers the memory, even if it's not necessarily related to the memory. And if we haven't done the work to deal with that past, right? If you've not done the work to be prepared for when that past shows up, if I haven't done the work for when that past shows up, it can overwhelm us. And it can actually start to harm us in very real ways and can cause us to harm others in our lives. Relationships, interactions, all that stuff starts to come flowing out of us. And the only way to not have that happen, the only way to be prepared is to actually deal with it. So how do we deal with it? How do we become free of it? The only way to become free of it is to go through a process. And that first step to being free is forgiveness. Right? If you have actually inflicted harm or cruelty on someone else, we have to seek forgiveness. We have to apologize, but also go beyond that, doing what we can to restore that person in some way. And if we have been the ones who are harmed, we have to give forgiveness. And I know that is not an easy thing to do. And it's important to understand that the choice to forgive someone for what they've done does not mean that what they've done is okay. Forgiveness simply means that you're releasing it. You're releasing the person from it. And you've decided to stop holding on to it. You're not going to hold it against the person, and you're not going to hold on to that pain. You're going to let it go. Not an easy thing to do in many cases. And it's a process and it takes time. But if we do not do that, right, the pain of our past will always hold on to us. It will always have a hold on us. Because as long as we're holding on to unforgiveness, what we're choosing to do is let the pain of that event hold on to us. And we actually see that play out in the story of Joseph and his brothers. Because as far as we can tell from the narrative, Joseph's brothers never apologize, never make amends, never provide any sort of restoration. They kind of just keep going on. And the thing we find is if you read through the narrative, they appear to live in fear of Joseph the rest of their lives. They're like constantly afraid that Joseph is going to try to get even with them in some way. To the point that when their father eventually dies, they run and lie to Joseph and say, hey, Dad said you have to forgive us. Yet they never really asked for forgiveness, at least not as far as we can tell. But we notice that Joseph handles things differently. That Joseph actually does forgive them. In fact, he even forgave them before they'd even told him that Dad said you had to. He actually made the choice to forgive them. And one of the things we find in one of his interactions with his brothers, he's like, don't be angry with yourselves. Don't be upset with yourselves. I've moved on. And he actually demonstrates that he doesn't just say he forgives them. He actually behaves positively towards them. He uses his position of power in Egypt to bring the whole family back together. That he brings his father and his father's wives and his brothers and their families, and they all come in and they move into Egypt, into really prime, nice land. I mean, you could have easily seen Joseph helping out Dad, but not the brothers. But he brought everyone together and used his position to help all of them have a richer life. And through that, Joseph truly becomes free. His past no longer holds on to him. And then he goes on to do something that in some ways it's hard to imagine. He even finds purpose in his suffering. Because one day when he's talking to his brothers and interacting with them, and he's reflecting on all the stuff that has happened to him, again, he says something that seems unimaginable. Joseph says this: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph realizes that had not all the things he'd been through happened, he wouldn't be in the position he is in right now. Had those things not happened, all the way to the mistreatment by his brothers, going all the way back that far, Joseph would not have been in position to save so many people's lives by the way he managed the food supply. See, the thing is that this journey that Joseph had been on had transformed him. He learned to do things he would not otherwise have been able to do. That God had not inflicted this journey on Joseph, but God did make use of it. Again, God had not inflicted this journey on Joseph, but God did make use of it. And as I wrap up, that's the thing I want to encourage us all with. If we think through this whole story of Joseph and all the pain he dealt with and how he dealt with each day and how he gets to the other side, and as he deals with his pain, he begins to be able to do things he would not otherwise have done. For you, for me, whatever pain you're carrying, you can be free of it. And if you will do the work to be free of it, to extend forgiveness, to embrace healing, to bring restoration as best you can, God will use what you've been through in a meaningful and powerful way. And I truly believe it, and I've seen this in my own life, that if you will do that, God will enable you to do things that you've never dreamed of. And as hard as it is to imagine, your journey, as difficult as it has been, is part of what made that possible. But in order to really begin to live that, we've got to embrace what we face, what we've dealt with, the pain we've experienced, enter into a path of forgiveness, get support and counseling if necessary, and move to the other side of it into freedom. And if we will do that, God will empower us to use those experiences, as hard as they were, to transform this world around us through our lives. That's what we see as we look at the life of Joseph, and that's what we can live in our own lives.